Hekethsaral Grand Assembly Chamber was not built for comfort. It was built for permanence. Its walls were constructed from compressed asteroid silicate, quarried from a belt that had circled a dying star for 4 billion years before the Hekethsaral decided it had a better purpose. The ceiling was low by galactic standards, barely 40 meters at its apex, but the acoustics were engineered so that even a whispered word from the circular dais at the chamber's center would reach every ear in the hall with equal clarity. Every word spoken here was meant to be heard. No species was permitted to pretend otherwise. On the morning of the 44th emergency session of the Galactic Council, if morning had any meaning aboard a station that perpetually orbited a red dwarf, 31 delegations sat in their designated arcs around the dais. 31 species, 31 flags, 31 translators running their near real-time language matrices through the same central processing system that had been in continuous operation for over 2,000 years. The 32nd seat was empty. It had been empty for 11 years, ever since the Council dispatched its initial contact probe toward the third planet of a minor yellow star in the Orion Arm. The planet was unremarkable on paper. Oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, significant water coverage, active tectonic geology. What had drawn the Council's attention was not the planet itself but the radio frequency emissions that had been leaking into space since approximately 200 years before first contact. A chaotic, overlapping, entirely unencrypted burst of electromagnetic noise that the Council's listening arrays had initially classified as geological interference. It was not geological interference. The species calling itself human, or more precisely referring to its collective civilization as humanity, had been broadcasting its existence into the cosmos for 2 centuries without apparent concern that anyone might be listening. The Council's xenolinguistics team required 18 months to develop a working model of the primary communication language. Another 6 to verify it against secondary and tertiary dialects. The findings had been, in the sterile language of an academic report, anomalous. In the language of the species sitting in that chamber waiting for proceedings to begin, the findings were alarming. Ambassador Veldroshan of the Hekethsaral was presiding today. She was a careful diplomat, 400 years into a career that had navigated 37 border disputes, 9 resource arbitrations and 2 near wars. She had managed all of them without raising her voice. She had a reputation for patience that bordered on geological. But as she reviewed the summary brief on her data slate for the 4th time that morning, she found herself experiencing something she hadn't felt in decades. She was uncertain. We have encountered civilizations that were aggressive. Civilizations that were passive. Civilizations that had destroyed themselves before we arrived. We have never encountered one that appeared to be entirely comfortable with all 3 possibilities simultaneously. Hekethsaral Intelligence Assessment Pre-Contact File. Sol 3. The 32nd delegation arrived 14 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin. They came through the main entrance, not the diplomatic side corridor that most delegations used when they wanted to avoid the assembled press drones hovering in the outer hall, but the main entrance, the one that opened directly onto the central observation gallery where 200 journalists from a dozen species sat with their recording equipment. The human delegation walked through that entrance deliberately, and if they were aware of the attention it drew, they did not appear troubled by it. There were 3 of them. The Council protocols required a minimum of 2 per delegation. Most species sent 5 to 12. 3 was permitted and 3 was what humanity sent. The lead delegate was a woman named Dr. Lena Vasquez, 44 years old by Earth's calendar, a career diplomat with a background in theoretical physics and, according to her intelligence file, 17 years of prior service in her nation's military research division. The 2 who flanked her were identified as senior advisors. They were younger, quieter, and their eyes moved with the practiced, unhurried efficiency of people who had spent time in rooms where reading the environment quickly was not a professional skill but a survival one. Vasquez took her seat at the 32nd arc. She set a small physical case on the table in front of her, an unusual gesture in an era of holographic documentation, and folded her hands over it. She looked at the dais. She looked at Veldroshan. And then she did something that no record of any first contact proceeding in the Council's 2,000-year archive had ever documented. She smiled. Not at anyone in particular. Not a diplomatic smile calibrated for cameras. It was quiet, almost private, the expression of someone who has walked into a room and recognized exactly what kind of room it is. Veldroshan had reviewed the xenopsychological briefing on human facial expressions. She understood technically what a smile meant. She understood that in human social contexts it could signal warmth, submission, confidence, or, and this was the entry that had given her pause, the recognition of a situation one had already planned for. She called the session to order. Her voice was steady. Her hands, beneath the table where no translator lens could read them, were not. End of Part 1. Galactic Council's Pre-Contact Intelligence Division had been compiling its file on humanity for 11 years. The file was not short. By the time Veldroshan received the final consolidated report 3 days before the 44th emergency session, it ran to approximately 40,000 pages in the Ketsaral standard documentation format, a length that placed it in the top 4% of all pre-contact assessments the division had ever produced. The civilizations in the top 4% were not, historically, the peaceful ones. The opening section covered the basics. Sol 3 was a terrestrial planet, third from a G-type main sequence star, mass 5.97 times 10 to the 24th kilograms, surface gravity 9.8 meters per second squared. Axial tilt 23.4 degrees, producing significant seasonal variation. The planet's biosphere was old by galactic standards, approximately 3.8 billion years of continuous biological development, producing an ecosystem of extraordinary complexity and, the report noted with careful phrasing, notable predation density. The planet had, over its history, experienced 5 mass extinction events of sufficient severity to eliminate over 75% of existing species. Life had recovered from all 5. Humanity had evolved on this planet approximately 300,000 years ago. The report spent considerable time on this number because 300,000 years was, in the context of galactic civilizational timescales, nothing. The Ketsaral had been spacefaring for 60,000 years. The Murvelith had been a unified interstellar civilization for over 180,000. Humanity, by comparison, had invented written language approximately 5,000 years ago, achieved powered atmospheric flight approximately 120 years before first contact, and reached orbit approximately 60 years after that. / Pre-Contact Intelligence Division, Excerpted Analysis, File, SOL3HC / Rate of Technological Development, Extreme Outlier. Modeling suggests current trajectory unsustainable by standard civilizational stress factors. Recommend re-evaluation of standard projections. Civilization appears to accelerate under conditions that historically produce stagnation or collapse in comparable species. Cause, undetermined. The political section was where the report became genuinely difficult reading. Humanity, at the time of first contact, was not unified. This was not unusual. Many pre-contact species existed in fractured political arrangements. What was unusual was the nature of the fractures. The planet was divided into approximately 195 recognized nation-states, plus several hundred subnational entities with varying degrees of political autonomy, plus a constellation of international organizations, treaties, and alliances that overlapped, contradicted, and occasionally openly competed with one another. The Council's political modeling team had spent 3 years attempting to map the decision-making architecture of human civilization and had eventually filed a report that concluded, with admirable academic candor, that the architecture appeared to be functioning despite having no logical reason to do so. In the military section, the report's tone shifted. This was the section that Veldroshan had read 3 times. Humanity maintained active armed forces across nearly all of its nation-states, with the largest concentrations organized under several major geopolitical powers. The report listed figures: standing military personnel in the hundreds of millions globally, armored vehicles in the hundreds of thousands, naval vessels in the thousands, atmospheric aircraft in the tens of thousands, nuclear warheads. The report paused on this entry with a parenthetical note that read, see Appendix C, Existential Weapons Retention. In the low thousands, distributed across 9 nation-states. Humanity had possessed the technical capability to eliminate its own civilization multiple times over for approximately 80 years. It had not done so. The report's authors had modeled this outcome against historical data from 43 other civilizations that had reached equivalent destructive capacity and found that the probability of species survival past the 40-year threshold was, under standard models, 23%. Humanity had cleared the 40-year threshold. It had cleared the 60-year threshold. At the time of the report's filing, it was approaching the 80-year threshold with what the psychological assessment team described as studied institutional awareness and inadequately explained collective restraint. The cultural section ran to 12,000 pages and Veldroshan had not read all of it, but the executive summary contained several observations she had found herself returning to. Human civilization, the summary noted, demonstrated an unusual relationship with adversity. Most species, when subjected to catastrophic stress, famine, war, epidemic, environmental collapse, exhibited predictable patterns: population decline, technological regression, social fragmentation. Humanity exhibited these patterns in the short term. In the long term, it exhibited what the report's authors had labeled, with evident frustration at the inadequacy of the terminology, adaptive consolidation. The catastrophes that should have ended human civilization had repeatedly and without obvious mechanism, produced instead the conditions for its next phase of development. The final section of the report, the recommendation section, was 2 pages long. This was unusual. Recommendation sections were typically the longest part of any pre-contact assessment. 2 pages suggested that the report's authors had found the standard recommendation framework insufficient and had declined to pretend otherwise. The 2 pages said, essentially, "We have encountered a civilization that does not fit our models. We recommend proceeding with formal contact under Council protocol, with elevated monitoring, and note that our standard risk assessment tools were not designed for this category of subject. We recommend the Council treat this file as a living document and update its assessments as contact proceeds." Veldrosian set down the report. Through the chamber's viewport, the red dwarf's light painted the station's docking ring in shades of copper and dark amber. Somewhere in that docking ring, the human delegation's transport vessel was berthed, a small, angular craft that her team had identified as a modified deep space survey vehicle. Modified in ways that her technical staff had found interesting. Not threatening, they had been careful to say. Interesting. She had asked what the difference was. Her technical advisor had taken a moment before answering. Threatening, he had said, is when someone brings a weapon you understand. Interesting is when they bring something you don't recognize but they clearly know how to use. Formal proceedings of the 44th emergency session began at the 2nd hour of the station's arbitrary day cycle, and for the first 4 hours they were almost entirely procedural. Credentials were verified. Translation matrices were confirmed. The chamber's recording protocols were activated. Representatives from the Judicial Oversight Division, a small, precise species called the Velethkur who had administered council proceedings for 800 years and seemed to derive genuine satisfaction from the work, circled the chamber with their documentation tablets, confirming that all parties were present and that the record was clean. Veldrosian watched the human delegation throughout this process. Dr. Vasquez sat quietly, her physical case on the table in front of her, and listened to the procedural readings with the attentiveness of someone who understood that the procedure itself was information. Her 2 advisors did the same. None of them used the session's first recess to confer with each other. They didn't appear to need to. The substantive proceedings opened with the council's formal statement of concern. Veldrosian delivered it herself as presiding ambassador, reading from the prepared text that had been approved by the Security Subcommittee 3 weeks prior. The statement was 40 minutes long. It covered, in diplomatic language calibrated to be firm without being inflammatory, the following points: that humanity's unregulated electromagnetic emissions had constituted a de facto broadcast of its existence to an interstellar community it had no knowledge of, that this broadcast had attracted the attention not only of the Council but of several non-Council entities whose intentions toward new species were not guaranteed to be benign, that humanity's current technological level, while impressive given its developmental timeline, fell significantly below the threshold considered necessary for independent interstellar defense, and that the Council's formal concern was, therefore, the security risk posed not by humanity itself but by humanity's exposure. Veldrosian paused at that point and looked at Vasquez. The human delegate was listening. Her expression was attentive, composed, and entirely unreadable. The statement continued. Given these concerns, the Security Subcommittee had prepared a preliminary framework for what it was calling a protected emergence protocol, a structured process by which humanity would be formally brought under Council recognition while its technological and defensive capabilities were developed to an acceptable level. The protocol had 3 phases. In the first phase, Earth would be registered as a developing world under Council jurisdiction, granting it certain rights while placing certain restrictions on its independent military development. In the second phase, spanning an estimated 40 to 60 years, Council advisors would oversee a guided technological development program. In the third phase, subject to assessment, humanity would be eligible to apply for full Council membership. The word oversight appeared 11 times in the statement. The word restriction appeared 8 times. The phrase Council jurisdiction appeared 6 times. Protected emergence was the Council's standard framework for pre-spacefaring civilizations. It had been applied 17 times. 14 of those civilizations were now full council members. 3 had declined the protocol. The council's file did not record what had happened to the 3 that declined. Background notes, Session 44, Judicial Oversight Division. When the statement concluded, there was a recess of 30 minutes. In the gallery above, the press pool stirred. The Murvelith ambassador leaned toward her deputy and said something in their subfrequency dialect that the translation matrix was not configured to capture. The Vethoran delegation, a deeply conservative species that had been resistant to the very concept of humanity's invitation to this session, sat with their typical rigid stillness, watching the human delegate with compound eyes that conveyed nothing legible to non-Vethoran observers. Vasquez spent the recess at her table. She didn't stand, didn't consult with her advisors, didn't request a private caucus chamber. She opened the physical case on the table, reviewed something inside it. Veildrashan could not see what from her angle, closed it again and sat with her hands folded on the case's surface. When the session reconvened, Veildrashan offered the floor to the human delegation for initial response. This was standard protocol. The presenting party stated its position, the responding party was given time to acknowledge it. The expectation was not an immediate counter-proposal. The expectation was an acknowledgement, perhaps a request for clarification, perhaps a statement that the delegation would need to consult with its home government before responding substantively. This was how first sessions worked. This was how they had always worked. Vasquez said, "Thank you, Ambassador. We understand the Council's position. We're prepared to respond substantively today." The chamber was quiet in a way that had texture to it. 31 delegations recalibrated something in their assessments simultaneously. The Velith Corps documentarian nearest the dais lifted his tablet and made a notation that, in his careful administrative script, read simply, "Deviation from expected protocol, note for record." Veildrashan said with commendable steadiness, "The floor is yours, Dr. Vasquez." Vasquez stood. She was not a large person by human standards, and by the physical scale of several species in the room she was quite small. She stood with the unhurried posture of someone who had given important presentations before, not the performance of confidence but the genuine article. She did not reach for a holographic display array. She did not produce documentation. She looked around the chamber with those quiet, dark eyes, and Veildrashan had the distinct and professionally unsettling impression that the human delegate was, in that moment, exactly as comfortable as she appeared. "We appreciate the Council's concern for our security," Vasquez said. "We share it. We'd like to talk about what we've done about it." And then she opened the case. The case contained a data chip. Nothing else. A standard format interstellar data chip, the kind the Council used for formal documentation exchange, the kind that any species with basic technical contact could manufacture within weeks of obtaining the specifications. Vasquez held it up briefly so the chamber could see it, then placed it on the data reader embedded in the delegates table. The chamber's central display system activated. What populated the display was not a presentation deck. It was a star map. The map was immediately recognizable to every delegate in the room because it used the Council's own cartographic standard. The same coordinate system, the same spectral classifications, the same boundary demarcations that the Council had been using and refining for 2 millennia. The Council's territory was shaded in the standard administrative gray. Member species' home systems were marked with their registered sigils. Known non-Council entities were marked in amber. Contested regions were marked in pale red. And then there was a region of the map that was marked in a color that wasn't part of the Council's standard cartographic palette. It was a deep, specific blue, not the blue of water or sky, but the blue of deep spectrum sensor returns, the color that appeared on certain scanning systems when they were detecting structured electromagnetic activity at distances beyond their normal operational range. The blue region was centered on Sol. It extended outward in an irregular sphere with a radius of approximately 4 light-years, encompassing the Sol system itself, the nearest stellar neighbor and 2 others. Vasquez let the chamber look at it for 30 seconds before she spoke. "We became aware of the Council's observation of our system approximately 8 years ago," she said. "Your initial probe was detectable at the sensor resolution we had available at the time. Not immediately, it took us 14 months to distinguish it from natural phenomenon. But we found it." The chamber's silence had a different quality now. Veildrashan was aware of it the way one becomes aware of a change in atmospheric pressure. Not through any single sensation but through the aggregate of many small ones. "We spent the following 3 years making a decision," Vasquez continued. "It was not a simple decision. We had, at that point, identified that we were being observed by a technologically superior civilization. We had no information about its intentions. We had no interstellar capability of our own. We had several options. She paused. We could attempt to conceal our capabilities and present as less developed than we were. We could attempt to signal cooperation preemptively. We could attempt to accelerate our own defensive development to achieve some level of deterrence before contact was established. We did all three. The human delegate said this without emphasis, without any theatrical pause. She said it the way one states a sequence of completed tasks, matter-of-factly, as if the choice to simultaneously manage the appearance of weakness, extend a hand in cooperation, and build a defense were simply what a rational actor did when it had time to prepare. Session transcript, Day 1, Observer Notes, Muir-Velith Delegation. The star map updated. Overlay data populated the display, sensor network coverage, represented as a web of thin lines extending outward from Sol to the boundaries of the blue region. The network was dense. Not military dense, not the aggressive sensor carpet that a species on a war footing would build, but the kind of deep space monitoring architecture that a civilization built when it wanted very good information about what was happening in its immediate neighborhood and intended to have that information for a very long time. This is our current early warning sensor network, Vasquez said. Its primary function is detection. It monitors for artificial electromagnetic signatures, drive signatures, mass displacement, the standard indicators of spacefaring activity. It went live in full operational capacity 14 months ago. Coverage is not complete. We don't have the assets for complete coverage, but we have sufficient redundancy that any approach to Sol system from any direction will be detected with enough lead time for a response. A response to what? The question came from the Vethoran ambassador. It was not asked in a hostile tone, but the Vethoran did not modulate tone in ways that non-Vethoran found easy to read, so the chamber received it as the challenge it may or may not have been. Vasquez looked at the Vethoran ambassador. She did not look at Veildrashin for permission to answer the interruption. She simply answered it. To whatever arrives, she said. We don't have the capability for offensive interstellar operations. We're not building toward it. What we're building toward is the ability to make any uninvited approach to our system expensive enough that the cost-benefit analysis doesn't favor it. We're not trying to match anyone's fleet. We're trying to make Earth the least appealing target in this region of space. She let that sit for a moment, then added, We've had 8 years to work on it. The Council took 11 years from first detection to this meeting. We used the time we had. It was at this point that Veildrashin finally understood the smile. It wasn't confidence exactly. It wasn't arrogance. It was the expression of someone who had walked into an uncertain situation having already done the homework, who had sat with the worst-case scenarios, worked through them methodically, made the preparations that were available, and arrived at a place of genuine, earned equanimity. Not the pretense of calm. The actual thing. The human delegate had come to a room full of civilizations that were older, larger, and more powerful than her own, carrying a data chip that said, We know the situation, we've been preparing for it, and we're ready to have an honest conversation about it. The smile had nothing to do with the council at all. It was the expression of someone who had already made peace with whatever the room might bring. Veildrashin found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she respected it enormously. The presentation that followed the star map lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Veildrashin had presided over the council for long enough to recognize the difference between a delegation that was presenting and a delegation that was briefing. Presenting was performative. The information was organized to persuade, to impress, to manage the emotional temperature of the room. Briefing was functional. The information was organized to inform, with the implicit assumption that the audience was capable of handling it accurately and would benefit more from clarity than from curation. Dr. Vasquez was briefing. The sensor network was the first element. It was not, Vasquez explained, a unilateral human project. It had been constructed under the auspices of what she called the Sol Coordination Authority, a body that had been quietly constituted 7 years ago between Earth's 6 largest spacefaring national programs for the explicit purpose of developing a joint interstellar awareness capability. The SCA did not have a public profile. It was not unknown. Several of Earth's independent research institutions had noted unusual activity in deep space sensor deployment and written papers about it, but it had no official presence in any of Earth's international governance structures. It existed entirely in the space between those structures, and it worked precisely because the nations that comprised it had agreed, without formal treaty and without public announcement, that this particular problem was too important for the usual political architecture. We have a complicated relationship with institutional cooperation, Vasquez said, and something in her tone suggested she was choosing this phrasing with care. Our history doesn't make it easy. But when the situation is sufficiently clear, we find ways to organize that our formal institutions can't manage. The SCA is one of those ways. The second element was the defensive architecture itself. The sensor network was paired with what Vasquez described, precisely as a deterrence lattice, a network of autonomous systems distributed through the inner Sol system and at the heliopause that were designed to complicate, rather than prevent, hostile approach. The systems were not, she emphasized, offensive in capability. They could not pursue. They could not project force beyond the system boundary. What they could do within the system was make any approach trajectory toward Earth predictably costly in material, in time, and in the advantage of surprise. They had been designed specifically against the doctrine of rapid overwhelming force, the military strategy that the Council's own defense assessments identified as the most commonly employed approach by the non-Council entities that the Council euphemistically called disruptive actors. // SEA Technical Summary, submitted to Council Record, Session 44 // Deterrence Lattice, Sol System Interior Coverage, 94.7%. Response time from heliopause detection to system-wide activation, 11.3 hours. Independent operational endurance, 18 months without resupply. Designed for denial of rapid overwhelming approach. Not designed for sustained engagement with peer military force. Assessment of own capability versus Council member state fleet, asymmetric. We are not trying to win that fight. We are trying to make it not worth starting. The third element was the one that generated the most sustained quiet in the chamber. Vasquez presented it last, and she presented it without emphasis, which was, Veldrosian had come to understand how humans signaled that something was important. The less they performed importance, the more seriously it was meant. The third element was people. Over the past 6 years, Earth's major spacefaring programs had significantly increased the operational tempo of their crewed deep space missions. This was publicly known. It had generated considerable commentary in Earth's media and academic communities. What was not publicly known was that a portion of these missions had not been scientific or commercial in purpose. They had been what Vasquez called resilience exercises, extended crewed operations in conditions of deep space isolation, communication latency, and systems degradation, conducted specifically to develop and validate the human capacity for long-duration independent operation far from Earth support infrastructure. We don't have an interstellar fleet, Vasquez said. We're not going to have one for a long time. But we do have several thousand people who have been trained and operationally validated for extended independent operation in deep space under adverse conditions, and we have the infrastructure to sustain and expand that capability. We're not building toward matching any member state's military capacity. We're building toward a posture where losing access to Earth, even temporarily, doesn't mean losing our capability to function. She paused. We learned this lesson the hard way internally. Civilizations that can only operate from their capital are fragile. We've been working on not being fragile. The chamber absorbed this. Veldrosian watched the delegates process it, the Murvelith leaning together in the quiet consultation they did when something required their consensus-building protocol, the Vethoran motionless and unreadable as always, the smaller delegations from the outer reaches of Council space watching with the particular attention of species that had, at various points in their own histories, been the ones sitting in the smaller chair at the larger table. The Ketzeral deputy ambassador leaned toward Veldrosian and said very quietly, "They've been doing all of this for 8 years. Without contacting us. Without asking for guidance. Without knowing if we were hostile or benign." Veldrosian nodded. "They decided that knowing or not knowing didn't change what they should do," the deputy said. "So they just did it." "Yes," Veldrosian said. Pause. "That's either very wise or very dangerous. In my experience," Veldrosian said, "with species capable of sustaining that kind of long-term planning under uncertainty, it tends to be both." End of Part 5. Session recessed for 6 hours after Vasquez's presentation. This was unusual. A first session recess was normally 30 minutes, but Veldrosian had called the extended break under her authority as presiding ambassador, using the procedural provision that allowed for it when, in her assessment, the delegations required adequate time to consult with their home governments before substantive deliberation. The provision existed. She had never used it before. She used it now because the alternative was having 31 delegations attempt to deliberate while still visibly processing what they had just been told, and that produced the kind of reactive decision-making that caused problems for decades afterward. She used the 6 hours to do 3 things. First, she reviewed the technical annexes that Vasquez's team had submitted as supporting documentation. Detailed schematics, operational logs, engineering specifications for the sensor network and the deterrence lattice that were sufficiently detailed to have been prepared by someone who expected scrutiny and had nothing to conceal from it. The Council's technical team confirmed, within 4 hours, that the documentation was internally consistent and that the capabilities described were, within the parameters of Earth's known industrial base and known materials science, plausible. Not certain. Plausible. That was a meaningful distinction, and Veldrosian noted it carefully. Second, she spoke privately with 6 of the Council's senior delegates. Not formally, not on record, but in the kind of frank bilateral exchange that had kept the Council functional for 2,000 years precisely because it happened outside the formal record. The conversations were variations on the same theme. The Protected Emergence Protocol had been designed for civilizations that needed development support and protection. Did humanity need either of those things in the form the protocol offered? The consensus answer was, not in the way the protocol assumed. The protocol assumed passivity. Humanity was not passive. Third, she had a 20-minute conversation with Vasquez herself. This was off-record, informal, and she had not told the chamber she intended to request it. She found the human delegate in the small consultation room adjacent to the main chamber, reviewing documents on a portable display, alone. Her 2 advisors were elsewhere. Vasquez looked up when Veldrosian entered, set down the display and waited. "I want to ask you something directly," Veldrosian said. "Not for the record." "All right," Vasquez said. "You've spent 8 years preparing for a contact scenario you knew nothing about. You prepared for the possibility that we were hostile. You prepared for the possibility that we were benign but would attempt to control you. You prepared for the possibility that something else entirely would arrive before we made formal contact." She paused. "What were you prepared to do if the Council's position had been openly threatening rather than paternalistic?" Vasquez was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, thinking. "We were prepared to make it clear that engagement with Earth would carry costs that a rational actor would prefer to avoid. We were not prepared to win a war against an interstellar civilization. Nobody sane prepares for that. But there is a significant space between winning a war and being worth the trouble, and we've been working in that space." Dr. Lena Vasquez, Informal Exchange, Session 44 Recess. "That's honest," Veldrosian said. "It's the only position that makes sense," Vasquez said. "We know what we are. We're one planet, one star, early in our development, and we've been broadcasting our location to the universe for 200 years without knowing it. The realistic response to that situation isn't to pretend it isn't dangerous. It's to make considered decisions about how to manage the danger with the resources we have." She paused. "The Council's protocol assumes we need protecting. We understand why. But we've been protecting ourselves. We'd like a conversation about how to do it together, rather than an arrangement where one party assumes responsibility for the other." Veldrosian returned to the chamber and called the deliberation session. It ran for 3 hours. She will not recount the internal politics of it here. The Council's deliberative record is sealed for 50 years under standard protocol, but she will say that the debate was serious, that the Vethoran raised legitimate concerns about precedent, that the Murvelith advocated strongly for a modified approach, and that the final vote was not unanimous. The Council voted 22-9 to decline the standard Protected Emergence Protocol in favor of a negotiated bilateral framework, a category that had been used exactly twice in the Council's history, both times for civilizations that had arrived at the Council's table in circumstances that the standard framework was not equipped to address. The bilateral framework meant, in practice, that humanity would enter into a direct negotiated relationship with the Council as a recognized independent party rather than as a ward of Council oversight. It meant the conversation Vasquez had asked for. It did not mean everything humanity wanted. The negotiations that followed, which are a separate story for a separate time, were difficult, lengthy, and repeatedly contentious. But they began from a premise of rough equivalence and standing that the standard protocol would never have offered, and that premise mattered more than any of the individual provisions that were eventually agreed upon. When Veldrosian announced the vote result, she watched Vasquez carefully. The human delegate received the announcement with a small nod and the same quiet expression she had worn since she walked into the chamber. Not triumph. Not relief. The expression of someone who had played the long game with patience and discipline and was now proceeding to the next phase of it. Behind Vasquez, one of her advisors, the younger one, the one with the watchful eyes, allowed himself, very briefly, a small exhale. Veldroshin noticed it. She suspected it was the most unguarded moment any of them had permitted themselves all day. End of Part 6. The formal record of the 44th emergency session was sealed according to standard protocol, but certain elements became part of the Council's institutional memory in the way that significant events always do, not through official documentation but through the accumulation of accounts, recollections, and analyses produced by the people who were present. Veldroshin wrote her own account 6 years after the session, at the request of the Council Historical Division. She took the task seriously. She had presided over 37 significant sessions. This was the one she thought about most. The human delegation left the station 4 days after the vote, once the preliminary bilateral framework was signed and the negotiating schedule for the substantive talks was established. They left the same way they arrived, through the main entrance, past the press pool, without apparent concern for the attention it drew. Vasquez made a brief statement to the assembled journalists that was 11 sentences long and contained nothing that was not already in the public record of the session. She answered 4 questions. She thanked the Council for its time. She expressed humanity's interest in a productive ongoing relationship. She wished everyone safe travel. She did not smile for the cameras. Veldroshin, watching from the gallery above, thought that was the correct call. In the weeks that followed, the analysis of the session's outcome was extensive and frequently mistaken. The most common misreading, in both the Galactic press and in certain Council member states' internal assessments, was that humanity had won the session through some combination of preparation and audacity, and that the lesson to draw was about the strategic value of arriving well prepared. This reading was not wrong exactly, but it missed what Veldroshin considered the more important point. The preparation had been necessary. But preparation alone would not have been sufficient. The Council had encountered species before that arrived well prepared for their first contact session. Several had been well prepared in ways that were aggressive or paranoid, or so defensively structured that genuine negotiation became impossible. Preparation in those cases had been a form of armor that prevented contact rather than facilitating it. What had made the session work, what had moved 22 delegates to vote against a 2,000-year-old protocol, was not what Vasquez brought to the table. It was how she sat at it. She had been honest about her civilization's limitations. She had not pretended that the deterrence lattice was more capable than it was, or that Earth was closer to interstellar parity than it was, or that humanity's internal political fragmentation was anything other than a genuine complication. She had not tried to impress the Council. She had tried to give it accurate information and a clear sense of what her civilization actually wanted from the relationship. What it wanted was not protection, not validation, not a shortcut to capabilities it hadn't developed. What it wanted was to be treated as a party capable of making its own decisions about its own future, with the understanding that its decisions would be better if they were made with access to the broader community it had unknowingly joined. The species that frightens me, the Murvelith senior delegate told her counterpart on the journey home, is not the one that arrives with weapons. It is the one that arrives without them and makes you understand very quietly that they've thought through what happens either way. Murvelith Delegation Private Record, Declassified Year 12 Post-Contact. Veldroshin spent a significant portion of the years following the 44th session working on the bilateral negotiations with Earth. They were, as she had expected, difficult. Humanity negotiated with a combination of extraordinary patience and occasional stubbornness that she came to understand was not a tactical posture but a cultural one, a reflection of a species that had developed its major institutions through centuries of argument and compromise and had internalized the process deeply enough that it was simply how they thought about problems. They didn't negotiate to win. They negotiated to arrive at something they could live with, and they were willing to spend considerable time on it. She came to respect this approach even when it exhausted her. 12 years after the session, Earth's first permanent interstellar presence was established. A small research station at the nearest stellar neighbor, staffed by a rotating crew of 48 from 6 nations, operating under the bilateral framework's research cooperation provisions. It was not a military installation. It had no weapons systems beyond standard emergency equipment. It was a laboratory, a listening post, and a way station, and it had been built with a construction timeline and a budget that would have seemed absurdly ambitious to Earth's engineers at the time of the 44th session and turned out to be merely characteristic. The station's designation in Earth's official registry was Alpha Station 1. Its unofficial name, used by its crews and eventually by most of the galactic community that interacted with it, was the one its first crew chief had given it on the day it went operational, scrawled on a bulkhead in what the crew called Mission Marker. A physical pen used to write things that were meant to stay. She had written it simply, first of many. Veldroshan visited the station in its third year of operation, on a tour of the bilateral framework's joint facilities. The crew chief, not the original one, she had rotated back to Earth, but her successor, a quiet man from the northern reaches of one of Earth's island nations, showed her around with the pride of someone who had built something and believed in what it was for. He explained the research programs, the logistical arrangements, the long-duration habitability systems that had been refined from the deep space exercises Vasquez had described at the session. He told her about the things that had worked and the things that hadn't, with equal candor about both. At the end of the tour, standing at the station's main viewport with the light of the neighboring star painting the observation deck in a reddish gold, Veldroshan asked him a question that had been with her since the 44th session. When Dr. Vasquez came to the council, she said, and the session could have gone any number of ways, when you didn't know yet what the outcome would be, were you afraid? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Of course, he said. We were all afraid. There's no version of that situation where you're not afraid. He looked out at the star for a moment. But fear isn't the same as helpless. We'd done the work. We knew the situation as well as we could know it. We'd made the decisions that were ours to make. He paused. What else is there to do after that except show up and see what happens? Veldroshan thought about the smile. The quiet, composed expression on Vasquez's face as she walked into a chamber full of civilizations older and larger than her own, carrying a data chip and the accumulated weight of 8 years of work. Not arrogance. Not bravado. The expression of someone who had done what could be done and arrived at peace with the fact that the rest was not entirely within her control. 400 years of diplomacy, and it had taken a species 300,000 years old to show her what that particular kind of courage looked like from the outside. She stood at the viewport a while longer, watching the light of a star that humanity had named Alpha Centauri long before it knew any other civilization had ever looked at it. Then she thanked the crew chief for his time, wished him and his crew well, and returned to her shuttle to begin the journey home. Behind her, through the viewport, the station's running lights blinked on against the dark, small, steady, and entirely undeterred by the scale of the space around them. First of many. End, complete series.